welcome to another episode of the MMA Lockcast. I'm your host, Manpreet, aka MMA Lock of the Night, your boy on social media at MMALOTN, and the architect behind the MMA Fight Archive, ensuring you leave no stone unturned for these upcoming MMA events. With over 5,300 fighter profiles for you to browse through, spanning 20 different promotions from all over the world. Find out why we have over 115 subscribers on the service, ensuring they have direct links to as many fights as possible so they can research all these fighters competing on these upcoming MMA events, knowing what to expect when they step foot in the cage. Once again, that is the MMA Fight Archive. There is a 7-day free trial for you to try it out for free. Check the link in the description below and take full advantage of all the events that we got posted coming up for this weekend. We got Aries FC, LFA 211, A1 Combat 28, PFL, UFC, and Fury FC closing the weekend out on Sunday. So all of that is posted on the MMA Fight Archive. Make sure you guys check it out. All right. The UFC is back this weekend with UFC Baku, which is going to be their introduction to the Azerbaijan region. It's the first event that's taking place in that country, and they have a few staples that they're able to bring along with them to try to, appease to the local crowd there, namely in the co-main event where they have Rafael Fiziev looking to bounce his 3-fight losing streak as he takes on streaking Ignacio Bahamondes. In the main event, we have Khalil Rountree looking to bounce back from that title fight loss that he had at the hands of Alex Pereira back in October. And now he takes on former champion Jamal Hill, who's also looking to buck a losing streak of his own. Decent all-around card. I believe it's 12 fights scheduled for this card. Some bangers for sure. Some weird big favorites that I can't wait to talk about on this card, just because I believe there is some value on some solid underdogs on this card. I think a lot of people are going to be looking to go chalk heavy, but I believe there should be a handful of underdogs that will make things a lot sweatier than they should be, or even going out there and forcing people to rip up those chalky parlay tickets. We'll see if we can identify which ones we should be pulling the trigger on and the ones that we should be avoiding, and maybe just siding with the chalky side of things. Before we continue, I just want to quickly go over the lock of the night and dog of the night play for this past weekend's UFC card, which took place in Atlanta. Not the best card in terms of my predictions. The one spot that I'm really kicking myself about for not pulling the trigger on. I passed on the fight completely, but to get Kamaru Usman as a, plus 200 and even better underdog against a guy like Joaquin Buckley, I wish I pulled the trigger there. I gave Buckley the benefit of the doubt that he was a new man at welterweight, 6-0. Obviously, Usman had other plans there, and I'm going to be honest. The card was a bit of a stinker, and I actually fell asleep before the main event, so I haven't even seen it yet. But the fact that I saw that Usman won, it's just been too hard for me to go back and watch that fight back because, again, I let another opportunity slip away from me there. But in terms of the lock of the night play, further going to the boring side of the card, I had the under 1.5 in the Mansour Abdul Malik and Cody Brundage fight, and they just stared at each other for about 2 rounds before they finally let them things loose in the 3rd round, and that ended up with that weird technical decision. I was kind of crossing my fingers and hoping that we'd get a no contest and possibly getting this under 1.5 nulled, but that was not the case. Abdul Malik ends up winning a technical decision there, but not the way that I expected that fight to play out. That now brings our lock of the night record to 25-23. I believe we went 2-1 over the weekend with our LFA and our PFL lock of the night plays hitting for us in a Jesus Pinedo, and I can't recall the other one off the top of my head, Dakota Hope. So we go 25-23 on the year now for a 52% hit rate, 1% increase from last week's 51%. So we are on the right track of things, but still a ton of work to do there. Dog of the night play, I believe I went 2-3 on the weekend over the 5 events that I covered, and that now brings our record to 29-29 on the year for a 50% hit rate. And in terms of the UFC, we ended up coming up short on Andre Petroski as Shabazian showcased a very educated game, picking apart Petrosky from distance and not overdoing his gas tank, which is what he's known to do. Not allowing Petrosky to have much success in that fight. So credit to Shabazian for improving the aspects of his game that have caused him troubles in the past, and that forces us to rip up our dog of the night ticket there. All right. We got 12 fights scheduled for this UFC Baku card. So without further ado, let's get right into it, where it starts off in the heavyweight division between Hamdi Abdelwahab coming in at -160, going up against the brother of the Usman, Kamaru Usman, who just won this past weekend in the main event. His brother actually starts off the card here in the curtain jerker spot, Mohammed Usman, who comes in at +140. Now, Hamdi Abdelwahab has been such a weird situation since coming into the UFC back in 2022. And that was when he had that highly contested bout against Don'Tale Mayes, where it seemed like the entire MMA community was really split on that fight, thinking that Abdelwahab was a tomato can and that Don'Tale Mayes was good enough to showcase those flaws in Abdelwahab's game. But Abdelwahab rocked him in the first round, got outpointed in the second round, and then was able to rely on his Greco-Roman wrestling background to grind out Mayes in the third round of that matchup. And he ended up winning it on the scorecards by split decision. But he did end up popping for some sort of, I don't recall what it was, but it was a steroid of some sort, and that caused Abdelwahab to be suspended for 2 years. He ended up returning earlier this year, I believe it was, when he went up against Jamal Pogues in a highly contested bout where, it seemed like the jab of Pogues was causing Abdelwahab some trouble, but it was enough for Abdelwahab to continuously move forward, land some big shots of his own, and win another very controversial split decision. A lot of people are saying that, it was a robbery, but upon watching the fight again, it seemed like a very close fight where the forward pressure and the big shots that Abdelwahab was landing seemed to outdo the somewhat inconsistent jab of Jamal Pogues. If he was a little bit busier with it, then sure, I could see the roaring, calls for a robbery in that matchup. And I was on Jamal Pogues that night. I remember shouting at my TV that Pogues should let go with his jab a little bit more, but he was just a little bit too tentative, and I came back to bite him in the ass that night. Abdelwahab seems to be settling into being more of a pressure power striker rather than leaning on his wrestling, but at a certain point, he's going to have to lean on it if he hopes to separate himself from some of these fighters. Now he's going up against Mohammed Usman, who's on a 2-fight losing streak. Another guy that's kind of lacking in terms of the output side of things, or at least putting some meaningful offense together, and ending up coming up short in his last 2 matchups against Mick Parkin and Thomas Peterson. We saw Peterson stick with a solid jab of his own, landing some big shots behind those. And even though Usman was a little bit of a pest with those jabs that he was landing on Peterson, it was clear that Peterson was putting more of an effort to land bigger shots on Usman, hence why the judges ended up going his way and sweeping Usman on the cards that night. Usman's a guy that's been, relatively overrated in my opinion. A guy that's not that high level of a striker, but that's where he leans on more often. He seems to be strong and powerful, but you don't really see it translate in terms of knockouts, nor his ability to control opponents with his wrestling. So he's kind of just falling short in some of the spots that you would expect him to excel at. In this matchup going into it, I really expected to be on the Usman side because I've thought so poorly of Abdelwahab in the past, but just watching the tape, I feel like Abdelwahab can dictate the pace of this matchup, and if he can work past some of the jabs of Usman, he might be able to land some big shots of his own, maybe land a few leg kicks as well, maybe even lean on some of his grappling, which I don't think will be a big factor in this matchup, but his ability to mix it up and then throw some big shots behind it could definitely cause Usman some trouble. So we've seen Abdelwahab deal with a guy that's a very good jabber like Jamal Pogues last time, and I feel like if he can do a similar thing here against Usman, he should get the win. But at -160, I have to pass here as I'm not fully sold on the Abdelwahab side of things. So in terms of a prediction, I will go Abdelwahab by decision. All right, next up, going from the heaviest men's weight class down to the lightest men's weight class, we're going to be talking about flyweights. Tagir Ulanbekov, who comes in at -405, going up against Azat Maksum, who comes in at +335. Now, starting off on the Ulanbekov side of things, it's unfortunate that he has not been more active throughout his UFC career. He missed all of 2024, although he was scheduled to fight Joshua Van in June of 2024. Unfortunately, he missed weight by 3 pounds, and the fight was ultimately called off, leaving Ulanbekov with no competition in that 2024 calendar year. But he did manage to return back in January with a very emphatic victory over previously undefeated fighter Clayton Carpenter, and we saw the usual Ulanbekov style of fighting. Decent striking from distance, but it was just a matter of time before he was able to engage in the clinch and the grappling, getting Carpenter to the ground and grinding him out in that matchup. Now that's 3 straight wins for Ulanbekov after coming up short against Tim Elliott back in early 2022, and I feel like if he stayed a little bit more active, this is a guy that could possibly find himself in title contention should he have been able to rack up a few more wins. He was supposed to fight former UFC title challenger and former Risen champion Kyoji Horiguchi in his return to the UFC, but Horiguchi was injured, and in steps Azat Maksum, who suffered his first pro loss last time around at the hands of Charles Johnson. Now, Maksum came into the UFC with a clean 14-0 record, very solid fighter. We saw him go up against Tyson Nam in his UFC debut, and it was a bit of an underwhelming performance. Even though he ended up getting his hand raised, it just did not seem he was all that good in the last half of the fight, but luckily did enough in the first 2 rounds to still get his hand raised there. And then we saw that come to bite him in the ass against Charles Johnson, where he had a solid first round where he dropped Johnson and had some good control time. But in the second and third rounds, he was unable to get to his wrestling and was forced to strike with a better striker. And that's where we saw Johnson get the better of him with more output, faster strikes, more strikes, not to mention a few takedowns for Charles Johnson as well. And you could see as Maksum was starting to slow down, he was clearly starting to break, and that led to Johnson winning that fight on the scorecards. Now, Maksum has not been in action for over a year and a half, and he's taken this fight on short notice. So a little bit of a question mark there in terms of why he would do that, especially considering that Ulanbekov is far superior than the past 2 UFC fighters that he's gone up against. So he's kind of got the cards dealt against him here, and I think that Ulanbekov will showcase that he will be worthy of that minus 400 price tag. Maksum could definitely be competitive early, but I have to give the edge to Ulanbekov in terms of grappling and scrambling, and I think that will ultimately lead to Ulanbekov continuously getting those dominant positions that he's used to getting, grinding this fight out, winning it on the scorecards. Wouldn't mind even throwing him into a parlay, as I don't think Maksum provides that much of an issue for him here. All right, moving over to the women's bantamweight division now. We got Irene Alekseeva coming in at minus 255, going up against Claudia Sygula, who comes in at plus 215. Now, starting off on the Alekseeva side of things, she is 1-1 in the UFC now. The first win came against Stephanie Egger, where she was able to quickly roll for a knee bar and force the tap from a judo player like Stephanie Egger. That was very impressive. But then last time around, we saw her come up short against a fighter that was clearly a better grappler in Melissa Mullins, who will actually be competing in the next fight that I'm going to talk about. But Mullins was able to just wear Alekseeva down, grind her out over 15 minutes, punish her from those top positions, but ultimately win that fight on the scorecards. Now, that showed good durability from Alekseeva, who's very difficult to put away. She's very physical. She kind of reminds me of Macy Chiasson in the aspect that there are some technical issues in their games, but their physicality and strength often allows them to bully their opponents and dictate the pace of their matchups. And I think that's going to be very key for here going up against somebody like Claudia Sygula, who's going to be looking to impose her own will with her grappling and her wrestling. Now, Sygula came up short in her UFC debut against Melissa Mullins, and that was a matchup where she tried getting to her wrestling, but was physically outdone by Mullins, who was far superior to her in that realm, and that quickly led to Mullins finding that finish in the second round of their matchup. Now, I don't really understand the reasoning why Sygula was signed to the UFC. She lost her first fight to a fighter that was actually on the PFL roster. I can't remember her name off the top of my head. Solid judoka, solid armbar specialist, and that's what she was able to catch Sygula with. Then Sygula went on a 6-fight winning streak, which ultimately ended up leading to her being signed to the UFC. But I think we quickly saw in the Melissa Mullins fight that she's not going to be able to cut it at this level. She's very active off her back in terms of searching for arm bars, but if she can't get it within the first 2 or 3 spots, she ends up coming up short, and that's where opponents are able to grind her out or get the better of her. she's been facing some low-level competition on the regional scene as well. So seeing her fight UFC-level competition now, you see why she's not really going to have much of a roster spot here for that long. Her striking, not all that great either. So in this fight, it's tough to fully get behind Alekseeva as a -255 favorite. I think her physicality will be the reason she ends up winning this fight. I think she's able to get Sygula to the ground and eventually find that position to find the finish, which is why the under 2.5 at plus money is very intriguing to me, because even if Alekseeva is unable to establish a dominant position, seeing the activity from Sygula's back with her arm bars, that could catch Alekseeva in a bad position, or even find a spot where Sygula is able to reverse the position and be a little bit more aggressive in terms of finding the finish. But like I said, I think Alekseeva will be able to replicate the strength that Mullins showed against Sygula, and that should end up being the difference maker here, leading to Alekseeva getting that finish by TKO or submission. I'm going to lean TKO, but the under 2.5, like I said, plus 130, very, very intriguing spot there. So I'm going to go with Alekseeva inside the distance. All right, moving over to another women's bantamweight matchup here. We got Daria Zhelezniakova coming in at plus 235, going up against Melissa Mullins, who comes in at minus 275. Now, this is actually a rematch of a fight that took place back in November of 2023 under the Aries FC banner. And that night we saw Melissa have her nose bloodied a little bit by Zhelezniakova until Mullins eventually got the fight to the ground after chain wrestling a couple of attempts. And then from there, she was quickly able to get to a dominant position and force a TKO over Zhelezniakova. Now, since then, Zhelezniakova picked up one more victory under the Aries FC banner and was quickly signed to the UFC without having to go the traditional Ultimate Fighter or Dana White Contender Series route, and we saw her picked up a very sloppy decision victory over Montserrat Rendon. That was a fight where she had to deal with a lot of the strength and physicality of Rendon in the clinch and grappling realm, but once she was able to create some distance, she was able to touch her up on the feet and clearly showcase that she was landing more effective damage, which led to her winning that fight on the scorecards. Then she went up against a bad stylistic matchup in Eileen Perez, who was quickly able to get her to the ground and find a dominant enough position to get that arm triangle choke and force the tap from Zhelezniakova. And that's where we see the issues in her game really start to come to surface. On the feet, she's a decent striker. She moves well, she throws good combinations, and she has good distance management. But if she fights somebody that is strong enough to take her to the ground, and not just off the first or second takedown attempt, but constantly throwing takedown attempts at her, it's just a matter of time before Zhelezniakova finds herself on her back and then ending up getting pummeled by most of her opponents. And somebody that's already done that, like I just said, was Melissa Mullins, and I think that Mullins will be able to replicate that. Now, just quickly talking about Mullins, that Zhelezniakova victory earned her spot into the UFC, where she was able to get a win over Irene Alekseeva, who we just talked about, a fight where she just out-grappled her, out-grinded her. And then she tried pulling off another victory against Nora Cornol, but she missed weight pretty badly that night, and it seemed after a few failed takedown attempts and an inability to keep Cornol on her back, Mullins completely gassed, leading to Cornol finishing her in the opening minute of the second round. But we saw Mullins bounce back against Sygula, but there is a big question mark there, considering that Mullins has now missed weight in both of her last two fights. Now, that's kind of unfortunate because she is a fighter that is capable of breaking into the rankings, especially with how dominant she can be with her grappling game. But the UFC has been known for cutting fighters that constantly miss weight, and Mullins is definitely one of those fighters. Even if she ends up winning this weekend and she misses weight again, it's more than likely the UFC will end up cutting her, so it's going to be very important for her to try to hit the scales and make the mark. But if she does, this is a very winnable matchup for her against Zhelezniakova, where I think she'll be able to firmly get the takedown, apply that top pressure once again, and get another TKO victory over Zhelezniakova. Now, the reason I say TKO, and especially with a fighter that is as grapple-centric as Mullins is, Mullins does not have a submission win out of 7 of her wins. 4 of her 7 wins have actually come by knockout, TKO. She gets dominant positions. She knows how to keep opponents there. And then from there, she lets go with big shots to eventually get the finish. And I think she'll be able to do the same thing here against Zhelezniakova. And I'll actually be honing in on that plus 265 KO prop for Mullins, as well as looking for a spot to parlay her with elsewhere on this card, but I'm going to go Mullins, and Mullins via TKO, probably by the second round. All right, middleweights throwing down here as we have Ismail Naurdiev coming in at plus 160, going up against Jun Young Park, the Iron Turtle, who comes in at minus 185. Starting off on the Naurdiev side of things, he made a successful return to the UFC. After initially going 2-2 with the promotion, he now manages to pick up that victory against Bruno Silva back in October, utilizing a few takedowns, but also showcasing that he was the superior striker. Now, it came out after the matchup that Bruno Silva was a guy dealing with a ton of depression and anxiety, and that was what's caused him to kind of just be pedestrian in a lot of his recent matchups, from his Chris Weidman fight to the Naurdiev fight to even getting knocked out by Marc-Andre Barriault a few months ago. So you wonder how much of a win and confidence booster for Naurdiev that actually is, considering he was largely fighting a punch or a punching bag for those 15 minutes. But Naurdiev is a guy that's largely relied on his Muay Thai to get his wins, utilizing a ton of combinations and opening up the head of his opponents until he can find that big shot to put them away. He has some decent grappling and wrestling as well, but it's obvious that fighters who have that advantage over him in the grappling realm are able to exploit that in him, keep him away from his Muay Thai chops, and often keep him on the defensive side of things. Another issue in his game in the past has often been his striking defense, where even in fights that he ends up winning, he gets hurt very badly, and that's where opponents are able to take advantage of his poor striking defense, land those big shots to either drop him, rock him, or completely knock him out. At 28 years old with 31 fights of experience, Naurdiev is gaining even more valuable experience in his UFC stretch, but we'll see how far the 28-year-old can take it, and he's really going to have to dig into his bag this weekend as he takes on a very tough Iron Turtle in Jun Young Park. Now, Park is coming off of a decision victory over Brad Tavares. I believe it was a split decision win, but I thought it was obvious that Park did his best and did really good work in the second and third rounds after getting hurt early on in that fight. I believe it was a split. It might have been a unanimous now that I'm thinking about it, but he got hurt in the first round, got dropped, but in the second and third rounds, we saw him apply that pressure, get to his grappling in the third round, and wear Tavares down and win that fight on the scorecards. Previous to that, he had lost a split decision to Andre Muniz, which ended up snapping a 4-fight winning streak for the Iron Turtle, and I think that was very demoralizing, especially knowing the type of trajectory he was on should he have gotten that win. He's 34 years old, so he's really got to get it going now, and I'm very bummed that he's fighting a guy in Naurdiev who is not ranked and won't do much for Park in terms of getting into the rankings either. Park, at his best, is a pressure-heavy grappler who has some very slick submissions up his sleeve, just as he showed in the Joseph Holmes, Dennis Tululian, and Albert Duraev fights. He's very good with that front choke series and that Dars and Anaconda, but he's also very good in terms of taking the back of his opponents and slowly working for rear naked choke positions. On the feet, he's also not that bad either. His durability often keeps him in fights, and his pressure allows him to keep opponents on the defensive, which is where he's ultimately able to bridge the gap between striking and grappling, where he often finds himself even more successful. Here against Naurdiev, there has been some love coming in on the Austrian side of things, but I ultimately think that Park should be able to grind this fight out by mixing his striking perfectly behind his grappling, and I think that's where we'll see him land bigger shots, get more control time, and maybe even pull out a submission in this spot. I think if he can apply that pressure early enough, he might be able to break Naurdiev and find that spot to clamp onto a choke and force a tap from Naurdiev. But in terms of an official prediction, I'm going to go with Park, and Park by decision. All right, moving down a weight class now. We're going to be talking about the 170-pounders as Seokhyun Ko comes in at plus 390, taking on Oban Elliott, who comes in at minus 515. Now, Ko actually picked up his UFC contract last time around in September as he shut down the grapple-heavy approach of Igor Cavalcante in a matchup where Ko just walked him down, landed some big shots, stopped a few takedowns, rinsed and repeated those big punches, and eventually ended up getting his hand raised on the scorecards there. Ko had won 7 of his 10 wins, or I guess you can call it 7 of his 11 wins by knockout, and actually used to go by Korean Tyson, just showcasing how big of a power puncher he is and how much of a thud you can often hear when he connects with his opponents. He has some decent takedown defense, trains with a solid group of guys, even former UFC Korean legend, I guess you can say South Korean legend, Stun Gun Dong-Young Kim, and I think he's obviously imparted some solid wisdom to the 31-year-old to try to have a successful UFC career. But Ko, when he's in his bag, is a guy that can go out there and put some solid combinations together and look for that big shot to try to knock his opponents out. But he's going to have to, go through some adversity here against Elliott, who has really seemed to get his confidence up to snuff, improved his cardio and his striking to try to make up the flaws in his game that other opponents have been able to make or have success against. So Elliott now is on a 3-fight UFC winning streak. Obviously won a handful of fights before that. Earned his contract through the Contender Series after he defeated a very tough Kike Brito, or Brito, I should say. Ended up defeating Val Woodward on the scorecards. Preston Parsons, that's where we start to see Oban Elliott start to round out his game a little bit better. In that fight, I was very big on Parsons, as I thought Parsons could take Oban Elliott down, keep that pressure on him, break him in deep water, and maybe even finish him in the third round. But we saw Elliott showcase tremendous takedown defense, showcase even better striking, dealing with the power punching of Parsons, walking him down and landing a ton of output, and then eventually showcasing his cardio as he went deep into that fight and still ended up getting the better of pressure Parsons. Then in his last matchup against Basil Hafez, a very close fight. It actually was 1-1 going into the final round with the momentum seemingly in Hafez's favor, but Elliott was quickly able to shut that down as he finished Hafez in the opening seconds of the third round, dropping him and following up with a few ground and pound shots. Elliott, at 27 years old, is clearly still improving his game. And again, a guy that has had those issues in the striking round before, he's going to have that tested here against Ko, especially if he's unable to get to his grappling right off the bat. So that's why at minus 515, it's a little bit questionable for me to be fully entrusting of Elliott at this number. I get it. Ko may not have fought a grappler like Elliott who's able to mix the striking and then get the grappling going behind it with such high pressure and high pace. But if Ko is able to stuff or shuck off the first few takedown attempts and force Elliott to strike with him, Ko makes this a much closer fight than, minus 515 indicates. You're talking about nearly 85% indicated, between 80 and 85% indicated for Oban Elliott there. I think that's a little bit wild. I'm still picking Elliott to win. And, I don't really have the conviction nor the confidence to try to snip some value here on the Korean fighter. But I wouldn't be mad at anybody looking to take a little bit of a shot on Ko to try to win this fight, probably even by knockout. But in terms of my prediction, I'm going to go Elliott and Elliott by decision. Moving down to the featherweight division now, we got Mohamed Naimov coming in at minus 235, going up against Bogdan Grad, who comes in at plus 200. Now, starting off on the Naimov side of things, he's coming off of a dominant decision victory over Con Offley in a matchup where he used a combination of his power striking as well as his grappling, even from a defensive perspective, as Offley often looked to try to take him to the ground. And that's where we saw Naimov get the better positions, land the more damaging blows, and make it clear that once the fight hit the scorecards, he was the one that was deserving of getting his hand raised. Now, he's a guy that I've often been very critical of in the past, especially since coming into the UFC, right? He came in on short notice against Jamie Mullarkey, was losing that matchup until he landed his big power shot and ended up getting the win there. Nathaniel Wood fight. I thought Wood probably deserved to win that fight in certain spots, but there were some fouls on the Naimov side of things that went unchecked and without penalization, and I think that caused Naimov to win that fight. The most egregious of them was when Wood nearly got Naimov out of there in the dying seconds of that fight, but Naimov grabbed the inside of the glove of Wood, keeping him from landing more powerful shots, which obviously could have ended the fight. And then in his next matchup, his third UFC win against Eric Silva, it was clear Silva came in with a compromised knee, and it was just mere seconds after that Naimov was able to pick up on that, land a barrage of shots, and get the finish there. Then we finally saw Naimov suffer that first UFC loss against Philippe Lima, who was able to go toe-to-toe with him. Very close fight going into that third round, and that's where we saw Lima take advantage of the depleting gas tank of Naimov, get the back of Naimov, and eventually find that submission. But Naimov, learned from that matchup, had a much more complete performance against Conoffley and showcasing his potential that he still has. He's a power puncher with some good wrestling chops if he needs it, but if he can't dictate the pace or find moments to catch his breath, this is a guy that will start to slow and cause mistakes in the latter half of fights. And a guy like Bogdan Grad could definitely pull that out of him. Now, Grad earned his contract through the Contender Series by having an absolute war with Michael Aswell, but it was actually his first performance on the Contender Series against Tom Nolan back in 2023, which may have been the best thing for Grad. He got knocked out in less than 90 seconds in a fight where it was clear that he was the far smaller fighter to Nolan. That caused Grad to go down to 145 pounds, pick up a pair of victories under the promotion he fought for before, and then get another opportunity on the Contender Series. And his athleticism, his power, explosivity, his constant pressure allowed him to pull out that victory over against a very tough Michael Aswell. That led to Grad going up against Lucas Alexander in his UFC debut, and Alexander had some good moments in the first round of that fight, but it was obvious that the constant pressure of Grad caught up to Alexander, and that led to Grad getting that dominant position near the ending of the second round and eventually getting that TKO finish. Grad is an all-pressure, all-gas type of fighter who constantly looks to get opponents to the ground and utilizes BJJ black belt to either sink in submissions or find dominant positions to rain down ground and pound to force a stoppage from the referees. He's a very, very solid fighter, but there have been question marks about his durability in the past. In this matchup, it's once again going to be tested. There were surely moments in that Lucas Alexander fight where you're sweating your ass off a little bit, hoping that Grad can eat some of these shots well, and it showed that he could. And then from there, that's where his pace and pressure really starts to catch up to a lot of fighters. And that's the same thing he's going to have to go up against here with Mohamed Naimov. This is a guy where they're both pretty much the same size. Naimov has an inch height advantage there, pretty much nullified there. That's a bit of a wash. But if Naimov lands some big shots on Grad early, he can turn the tide of this fight, no problem. But if Grad can keep that pressure up, stay in Naimov's face, constant takedown attempts, landing big shots, keeping that pressure on Naimov, keeping Naimov on his back foot, he can cause Naimov to slow down, and that's where Grad often finds his most success, is when he eventually breaks his opponents and comes out on the other end with either a finish or winning fights on the scorecards. So to get him at plus 200, I think is a bit of a blessing here. You can get Grad round 3 submission at plus 4,500, which I think is an absolutely insane line, knowing that Naimov's last loss came by round 3 submission and knowing how much of a pressure fighter and how much Grad puts his foot on the gas, especially in deeper water. So I'm going to go with Grad here. I'm going to go with him to win this by by submission. I'm not sure what the Naimov by knockout prop is currently sitting at, but that might be the best hedge in case he does land that big shot on Grad early here. But from everything that I'm seeing, I think Grad has the chops to go out there and make things hell for Naimov in this matchup, ending up winning this fight by submission. All right, next up, we're talking about a lightweight matchup now between Nazim Sadykhov, who comes in at minus 440, going up against Nicholas Motta, who comes in at plus 340. Now, we'll start off on the Sadykhov side of things, who, similar to the previously mentioned Mohamed Naimov, has had a weird start to his UFC career with weird bounces kind of going his way to allow him to have this unblemished record in the UFC so far. Now, the first fight against Evan Elder, he was down on scorecards going into that third round, and Elder just needed to hold on or, continue doing what he was doing, outstriking Sadykhov to win that fight on the scorecards. But Sadykhov landed a beautiful knee that opened up a very bad cut on Evan Elder, which led to a stoppage of that fight, handing Sadykhov the win by TKO. Then his win against Terrence McKinney, I'll give him credit there. He survived the early onslaught of McKinney and then finished him in the second round. His second last fight against Vyacheslav Borshev, that ended up going to a draw because he got outstruck in the first round. He landed a big shot to hurt Borshev badly in the second round, earning a 10-8 on 2 scorecards. And then he once again got outstruck in the third round, which is very surprising because of how badly Borshev was beaten in the second round. It was surprising that Borshev was able to bounce back enough in that third round to win that round and force a draw in that fight. And then last time around against Ismail Bonfim, he did win the first round on 2 scorecards. And then there was a head kick that Sadykhov landed that caused a little bit of a damage to the eye of Bonfim. And he was able to battle out through the rest of the round and really just hold on. And then the doctor was brought in after the timeout or whatever you want to call it in between rounds, and there seemed to be a weird miscommunication between the translator and the doctor and Bonfim, which ended up causing that fight to be stopped and giving Sadykhov another doctor stoppage victory there. So that's what I mean, that there has been some weird spots for Sadykhov. He's a talented fighter, decent striking, decent grappling, but I'm very critical of his regional strength of schedule. Face some really low-level guys to end up getting his hand raised and eventually making it to the Contender Series. And we've seen often enough that he's getting outstruck by a lot of his opponents, which is why I'm kind of scratching my head as to why he is a minus 440 favorite here. The way he could look more minus 440 is if he goes out there and knocks Nicholas Motta out. But there has seemed to be a resurgence in Motta's career, showcasing some improvements in his game and allowing him to roll with some big shots from his opponents and dish out his own damage, which is why he's been able to put together 2 straight wins now against power punchers like Tom Nolan and Mahashate. Motta, power puncher, 32 years old, has a solid BJJ game if he needs as well. But we've often seen when he gets into his groove with his striking, is very difficult to deal with. It all comes down to his defenses being crisp enough so that he doesn't eat too big of a shot, or at least that he rolls with these big shots when they come at him so that he can go out there and try to get the better of his opponents and utilizing his technically superior striking, which is an advantage he often has over a lot of his opponents. He's won on the Contender Series. He was on the Ultimate Fighter Brazil way back in the day, and he has a ton of experience against some solid opponents through his 20 professional fights. Again, very surprised that Sadykhov is the big favorite here, and this is one of those spots where maybe Sadykhov by knockout might be a good enough hedge, but at minus 440 you're probably getting plus 100, plus 125 on a number like that. But I think Motta is more than worth the plunge here at plus 340 if he does not get deaded from jump. I think this is a fight where he can be very competitive in the striking realm against Sadykhov, and should this fight go the full 15 minutes, he's going to look much better than 80% indicated on Sadykhov here. So I'm gonna go with Motta again. I can already foresee some of the trash I'm going to be seeing in the comment section in terms of giving a guy like Motta the benefit of the doubt here and saying that he's a live underdog at plus 340. But in my opinion, I don't think Sadykhov has done enough to warrant that minus 440 number, especially against a guy that could have a striking advantage against him. So here's to Motta, hopefully landing big power of his own. I'm going to say he wins this fight on the scorecards. It's possible he can win by knockout as well, but I think Motta ends up getting his hand raised, and I think it comes by decision. All right, next up, we got the UFC debut of lightweight Tawfiq Musayev, who comes in at plus 150 against Miktaybek Orolbai, who comes in at minus 175. Now, starting off on the Musayev side of things, who rides a 2-fight winning streak now under the Rizin banner, I think it was a no-brainer that the UFC decided to sign him, especially when it was obvious that they were coming to Azerbaijan. Musayev proudly represents that flag and is an entertaining enough fighter for the UFC to take a shot on him, but when you see who he's losing to, it's obvious he may not make it to the top of the lightweight division, but he can surely go out there and provide some fireworks of matchups, especially if they match him properly. In his last 5 fights, he has 2 losses, which have come to Roberto De Souza, who's a very slick BJJ practitioner out of Rizin, and then Alexander Shabli, who was able to shut down Musayev's power striking approach, pick him apart, and then eventually land a beautiful teep kick where it seemed like his toes just dug into the sternum of Musayev and caused Musayev to quit there. Musayev is normally, like I said, a power puncher, likes to crash the pocket with his strikes, has some decent wrestling if he needs it, offensively speaking, but defensively, that's where he's ended up coming up short in a lot of his fights, or where guys have been able to get the better of him there. And he's surely going to be tested in that realm here against Miktaybek Orolbai, who's looking to bounce back after suffering a very close loss at the hands of Matthias Rombeski in a very back and forth and bloody affair between the two. Now, before that, Orolbai had a solid winning streak, had UFC victories over Earl Schmedich and Elvis Brenner, and he's a guy that constantly presents pressure with forward movement, a lot of grappling, a lot of clinching, a lot of just wearing guys out in the clinch, dragging them to the ground and making life hell for them. I love everything that we see from Orolbai, and I think that fight against Matthias Rombeski was a big wake-up call for him, seeing that he needs to hone in on certain aspects of his game if he hopes to continue to make it up the lightweight rankings, which has long been seen as the deepest division in the UFC company. He's going up against a 35-year-old Musayev, who I think still has some decent ability to be successful at this level. But similar to Michael Chandler, I think he needs to be given some favorable matchups, guys that are going to go out there and strike with him. And he's not getting that with Orolbai. Orolbai is going to look to drown him here, and I think he can be successful in doing so. It might be hard for Orolbai early, but we know he has damn good durability, and if he can continue to keep Musayev on his back foot, he'll have a better chance of staying away from the power shots that are coming back his way from the Azerbaijani fighter. I think that's what you would call people from Azerbaijan. Don't hold me to it. But I'm going to go Orolbai here. Orolbai by decision. I might pass on this -175 line. Maybe if we get some crazy action on Musayev, I'll reconsider if we get Orolbai closer to that -125 range. But at the current line, I think it's accurate. I'm going to go Orolbai and Orolbai by decision. All right, next up, we got heavyweights throwing down now as we have Curtis Razor Blaydes coming in at -270 going up against Rizvan Kuniev, who comes in at +230. Now, this was a fight that was actually scheduled to take place back in March before Curtis Blaydes ended up falling ill, I believe on fight day, and caused that fight to be postponed. Back then, he was -340. Now he finds himself at -270 earlier on in fight week. And I don't know if that's just because we're just waiting for that parlay money to start rolling in on Blaydes to push that number up a little bit more, or if people are starting to read into Kuniev and think that he has the chops to pull off the upset against a UFC veteran. Now, starting off on the Blaydes side of things, we know what his kryptonite is. Power punchers. Tom Aspinall, Sergey Pavlovich, Derek Lewis, Francis Ngannou. Those are the guys that have handed him losses, and it's because he starts to crack under the power that they start to present to him. Now, he's not completely lost on the feet. We've seen him showcase some decent striking chops in the past, mainly against Chris Daukaus, where he was able to pick him apart and maybe have the threat of the takedown help provide more of a efficient striking game, which led to the knockout victory for him. But normally, he looks to take opponents to the ground and smother them with that wrestling that he has. And for a heavyweight, he seems to have a good enough gas tank to do it over 15 minutes if he needs to. I think it all comes down to styles for him. If he's not fighting a big power puncher, it's more than likely that he can go out there and wear down his opponents and break them in deeper water. And he's going to have to do it up against a very tough and big Rizvan Kuniev, who's coming off of a knockout victory over Hugo Cunha on the Contender series. I believe that was last year. And that's where we saw Kuniev showcase some decent takedown defense and eventually punished Kuniev against the cage, getting that TKO finish. I believe it was at the ending of the first round. Now, Kuniev was actually a part of the PFL roster as well and had a victory over eventual champion Renan Ferreira, but that was a fight that was a little bit more hard-fought than a lot of people expected. I think Blaydes can be very competitive with Kuniev in the grappling, and I think he'll get the better of him there. I think a lot of his success will come with pushing Kuniev against the cage, wearing on his gas tank, and then eventually dragging him to the ground. And I think that we'll see constant takedowns here from Blaydes, constant pressure from Blaydes, and I think Kuniev does not have the type of power that's going to cause Blaydes too much trouble. That should allow Blaydes to dictate the pace of this fight, fighting it on his terms, and eventually winning this fight on the scorecards. And at -275, -270, I think this is a very parlayable spot for Curtis Razor Blaydes. All right. Co-main event time now, where we got lightweights throwing down, and we have the guy that's probably going to get the biggest pop on the card here in Rafael Fiziev, as he comes in at +110 against Ignacio Bahamondes, who comes in at -130. Now, I think the reason that we're seeing Fiziev as the plus 110 underdog is that he's on a 3-fight losing streak. Meanwhile, Ignacio Bahamondes finds himself on a 3-fight winning streak. Now, let's break down those 3 losses for Fiziev, though, right? 2 of them coming to Justin Gaethje in the biggest fight of his career. The first of which was, I believe, a co-main event of a pay-per-view taking place in England. Won, I believe, the first round of that matchup and then started to taper off in the second 2 rounds under the veterancy of Justin Gaethje. Then his next matchup was a main event against Mateusz Gamrot, and that was a fight where he was winning the first round, and then in the second round he injured his knee badly, and that caused a stoppage to the fight. So there is a bit of an asterisk beside that loss to Gamrot. Then he returned on short notice after rehabbing his knee and waiting for a fight. He got that short notice opportunity to try to avenge his loss to Justin Gaethje. Unfortunately, it did not come to fruition there as Gaethje was able to get the better of him once again, defeating him 2-1 that night. But Fiziev is still a guy that's very capable of breaking into title contention. We know his Muay Thai is probably one of the best in the lightweight division. He's very good with the combinations he throws and nasty leg kicks, and usually his striking defense is very much on point. He's also improved his grappling, where he's been able to land a few takedowns, even against guys like Justin Gaethje, who has some decent wrestling chops of his own. Now he gets a full training camp in front of a hometown crowd. Even though he trains out of Thailand, he represents the Azerbaijani flag to the fullest. Now he's going up against Ignacio Bahamondes, who's a streaking contender here, looking to build upon his submission victory over Jalen Turner from earlier this year. Bahamondes is now 6-2 with the promotion. His last loss coming to Ludovic Klein, who was able to grind out Bahamondes over the course of 15 minutes and win that fight on the scorecards. And, I think that's an aspect that a lot of people are overlooking, especially with Bahamondes coming off of 3 straight first-round finishes. He was able to knock out Christos Giagos. He was able to exploit and expose Manuel Torres, who was mainly just going out there and charging fighters. And then he was able to pull up or throw up a very nasty triangle choke to get the victory over Jalen Turner. Bahamondes is a great distance striker. 6'3", 75-inch reach. In this matchup in particular, he'll have, let me do my math here real quick, 9, 10, 11, 0, 1, 2, 3, 8, 7-inch, 6, 7-inch, doing quick math here, 6, 7-inch height advantage here over Rafael Fiziev, and he'll also have a 4-inch reach advantage. But I think the aspect that a lot of people are overlooking is that Fiziev is the much faster fighter, has a ton of power himself, but could also take this fight to the ground and grind out Bahamondes, just as a guy with a similar stature Ludovic Klein did last time around. So when I initially researched this matchup, it was a pick'em price, but the money seems to be coming in on the Chilean side, thinking that this momentum is going to continue on against a tough out like Rafael Fiziev. Now, I'll throw this out for you guys to consider as well. Fiziev was slotted to be on this card, and it is without a doubt that he was likely given a list of opponents that he wanted to, or that were willing to fight him on this event, and he picked Bahamondes. So that should make you think something, that he would not take this type of opportunity, especially, fighting the likes of Justin Gaethje, Mateusz Gamrot, Rafael dos Anjos, and take on a guy like Bahamondes in a fight that was somewhat put together on short notice-ish. Not getting the full 8 to 10 weeks that we normally see fighters normally get. And he picked Bahamondes. Should make you think. I feel pretty damn confident on the Fiziev side here that he can shut down the distance striking of Bahamondes. I think he can land the bigger strikes, and I think he ends up mixing in some takedowns here. And I think we might be seeing a lot of people read too much into Bahamondes submitting Jalen Turner last time around, thinking that if Fiziev does take this fight to the ground, Bahamondes is going to be the one that's attacking with submissions off his back and end up submitting Fiziev. I just don't see that happening. I think Fiziev beats him in every aspect of this matchup, and I think he makes it look quite dominant. One thing I'll give Bahamondes, he's very durable. He's very tough to put away, so I think we're going to see Fiziev win this fight on the scorecards, although I won't completely count out him utilizing his speed and power to land that big shot on Bahamondes to put him away. But I'm going to go Fiziev, and Fiziev by decision. All right. Main event now in the light heavyweight division, where we have former champion Jamal Hill coming in at plus 120, going up against Khalil Rountree Jr., who comes in at minus 140. This fight kind of has that similar feel of recency bias as the co-main event. Now let's break it down. start off on the Hill side of things, who won the title back in January of 2023, where he defeated Glover Teixeira over the course of 25 minutes, earning him the vacant, or sorry, not vacant, actually, it might have been vacant, because if I remember correctly, it was December 2022, where Ankalaev fought Blachowicz, and that fight ended up going to a draw, and then they allowed the Teixeira fight to be for the vacant fight, or vacant title, and Hill ended up beating him there. Then he injured himself. I think it was an Achilles injury that forced him out of action to vacate the title. And in that time, Alex Pereira ended up winning the title. And when Hill returned, a lot of people would say a little bit too early and hard position to pass up, given that he was being offered a title shot and to headline the honors of headlining UFC 300. He jumped on the opportunity and ended up paying for it by getting knocked out by Alex Poatan Pereira. He would try to bounce back quickly after that loss 2 months later at UFC 303, but then he ended up getting injured and pulled out of that matchup. Then he returned in January, where he went up against Yuri Prochazka in a very tightly contested matchup, which was 1-1 going into the final round, and that's where the chaotic nature and pressure of Prochazka really caught up to Hill, allowing Prochazka to land the big shot and put Hill away. Now Hill has a solid amount of time to prepare for Khalil Rountree, who he was originally scheduled to fight back in April, but the fight is now pushed to June to headline this card and give them 5 rounds to settle the score. Hill is a very solid striker, might not do the best things in terms of the technical side of things, but does a great job in terms of managing range, picking opponents apart from distance, and then landing those big power shots afterwards to try to knock them out. His takedown defense has been tremendously improved, so it's all about getting that striking going, maybe tightening up the defenses ever so slightly, but for the most part, he's still one of the top 5 light heavyweights on the roster. Speaking of top 5 light heavyweights, Khalil Rountree got a title shot as not one of the top 5 light heavyweights on the roster back in October, and that was to the surprise of many, as a lot of people believe Magomed Ankalaev should have gotten that shot against Pereira. But we saw how it all played out. Khalil ended up losing to Pereira. Magomed got his title shot back in March and ended up coming through there and getting the win, winning the title off of Pereira. But going back to Khalil fighting Pereira, that was a fight where Rountree was up 2 rounds going into the 3rd round, and then it seemed like Pereira's style really started to catch up to Rountree, and that's where we saw Rountree start to eat way more damage than he should have, started to slow down visibly, just got beat to a pulp, if we're being honest, until he is finished in that 4th round. One thing we've seen from Rountree improve over the last several years has been his confidence, throwing his hands, just being the cerebral killer that a lot of people knew that he could be. And that came through for him with big wins over Carl Roberson, Chris Dawkins, and even Anthony Smith. But I think that Dustin Jacoby fight is one that he probably didn't deserve to win. I remember that being a bit of a controversial decision, but got him the title shot eventually. And we saw that he is just not championship worthy. Now, this is another fight where I feel, the recent 2-fight losing streak of Jamal Hill, and not to mention the valiant effort of Khalil Rountree in his fight against Pereira, is making him the slight favorite in this fight. Just a few days ago, -160 was the line on Rountree Jr. So there is some bounce back coming in on the Hill side, which is what I have to agree with. I think Hill is maybe technically speaking, Rountree might be the superior Muay Thai specialist, but from an MMA striking perspective, I think Hill can be more effective here. And I think the 5-round nature of this fight will definitely play into Hill's favor. This could be competitive through a round and a half to 2 rounds, but as Hill continues to land his counters and make a Rountree pay for some of the leg kicks that it might be throwing, you got Hill with the 3-inch height advantage as well as a 3-inch reach advantage. I think that will come into play here as he just picks Rountree apart from distance. That's Hill at his best. A guy that just plays on the outside of his opponent's offense, and then when his opponent comes into that no-man's zone, that's where he starts to let go with his offense and really force these opponents to pay for the mistakes that they make. And I think he'll be able to do that here once again against Rountree. I think we'll see Hill land some big shots against Rountree, and I think within 3, maybe 4 rounds, he eventually finds that kill shot to put Rountree away and then asserts himself as one of the top light heavyweights once again. Maybe gets another number 1 contender fight after this, but the most important thing, I think he pulls off the upside here and knocks out Khalil Rountree within 3 or 4 rounds. There you guys go. Full card breakdown for UFC Baku. Very fun fight now that I've broken it down, or fun card overall. 12 fights all in all. We also have PFL going down on Friday. We also have LFA going down on Friday. I'll have video breakdowns for both of those cards. The PFL one will likely drop on Wednesday, while the LFA one drops on Friday. So keep your eyes peeled for that. If you can't wait for those breakdowns, I'll already have written breakdowns for those on the Patreon page over the next coming days. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Otherwise, good luck on all your action this week, folks. I'll see you guys again tomorrow for the top 3 lock of the night candidates, as well as the chalk or not segment. I'll be dropping those both on Tuesday for you guys. See you guys then. Peace.
Last thing.